America's evil genius, Travis Cook, back with you for the second half of the Power Hour right here on TFRLive.com, Truth Frequency Radio, and the iHeartRadio app. Glad you are with us this late Sunday evening as you prepare for the week ahead. And as we always do at this point in the show, we like to take just a brief moment to remind you that if you are aware of the presence of illegal aliens in your neighborhood, in your community, in your workplaces, in your schools, in your churches, in the restaurants or businesses that you go to, if you are aware of the presence of illegal aliens, or even if you have a strong suspicion that they may be around, by all means, please contact ICE, Immigration, and Customs Enforcement. You can always reach ICE at 866-347-2423. Once again, that number for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, 866-347-2423. Call them and report whatever you might be aware of. The life you save may very well be that of someone you love. Take that number down, 866-347-2423. And as we resume this week on the program, obviously we're living in tumultuous times right now. I'm not telling you anything you don't know when I say that. But for a lot of us, I'm sure that one of the things we find ourselves doing when we find ourselves living through a tumultuous period in history is that there is a tendency for us to look back at earlier times in our life that maybe weren't so tumultuous. And you look back at those times and maybe you look for or you reflect on things that we used to do or used to believe in those times that really made sense, but that people seem to have lost sight of now. And you think of those concepts, you think of those ideas that we used to live by, and you start thinking of ways that maybe we could bring those back or bring those ideas into the modern time, because they could be of great help to us now. I think we all do that to a certain degree, and I certainly have been doing that over the last several weeks. I've been thinking back to my own history and earlier times in my life a lot. Particularly, I've been thinking back to my childhood a little bit. Now, to give you a frame of reference here, I was born in the mid-1970s and lived my entire childhood in southwest Missouri, in the Ozark Mountains, in a fairly rural area. And that means that kind of the frame of reference I have, the time I was growing up, as it were, the time that I kind of really started becoming aware of the world around me, would have been the 1980s. The 1980s was when that decade covered a lot of the time that I was in elementary school and junior high school and starting high school, right? And so as I was thinking back on my childhood in the 1980s earlier this week, I was thinking back to a particular attitude we had about a particular subject back then that was very different than what's being pushed today. You know, today, when we talk about crime, it seems like, especially in this era of Black Lives Matter and anti-cop protests and scrutiny of every single time a cop ever pulls a trigger for any reason, it seems like in this day and age, in 2020, there's an awful lot of sympathy for criminals that we see and hear every day. A lot of empathy for criminals, if you will. You know, you'll see a guy like the guy down in Atlanta that took that was drunk and passed out, and then the cops, tried to deal with him, and then he resisted arrest. He attacked the cops. He took their taser. He tried to use a taser on him. And all we hear out of these folks is, well, they shouldn't have shot him from behind. As though that was the bad thing that happened that night, Or even in a George Floyd situation. As we've said on the show before, the cop in the George Floyd situation went over the line. But nevertheless, the whole situation started because George Floyd tried to pass a counterfeit bill. You know, that's not exactly a good thing. And I hear people saying, well, should passing a counterfeit bill be a death sentence? As though there's some sort of acceptability or tolerance we should have for passing counterfeit money. And so I got to thinking about my childhood, and I was thinking back and realized, you know, when I was growing up, we really didn't have that degree, or really any degree, of empathy for criminal behavior or sympathy for criminal behavior. As I think back about it, when I was a young man growing up, and I would hear adults talk about the news or whatever, and I would hear them refer to a case where a criminal was either, you know, shot and killed by a police officer, or whether a criminal might have been, you know, breaking into someone's house and the homeowner shot him dead, or even if it was, you know, a drug dealer being shot dead by another drug dealer. The reaction you would almost always get from the adults that I grew up around was, well, he got what was coming to him, didn't he? There was no sense of empathy for it. There was no sense of tragedy for it. There was no sense of loss, that some violent criminal lost their life. Instead, it was kind of, I don't want to say reassuring, because that word goes a little too far, but it kind of spoke to you that, you know what, in some way, all's right with the world. This guy got what was coming to him. And before you start screaming racism and all kinds of other stuff at me, let me be clear that where I grew up, there were very few blacks when compared to other areas of the country in the place that I grew up. So when I'm referring to situations growing up where, you know, we hear of a cop shooting a criminal, or a criminal being shot by a homeowner, or meeting their demise in any sort of way, generally speaking, I'm talking about white criminals. That's what we had there. And nobody cried or complained when they died. Nobody went around marching. Certainly nobody went around burning buildings and looting. But to the much more straightforward perspective, no one had empathy for that criminal and said, well, that poor guy, that poor criminal got killed. What can we do to make sure this never happens again? You didn't hear that sort of discussion at all when I was growing up in the 1980s. When I was a kid, we as a society, at least where I grew up, we didn't really care about criminal deaths. We didn't really care about the comfort of criminals. We didn't really care whether or not criminals were treated with respect, because we understood and we knew that criminals did not deserve any respect. We knew and we understood that criminals did not deserve any comfort. And we knew and we understood that if people engaged in criminal action and they died as a result of it, then in the greater sense, really, they got what they deserved. And the culture of the time, the pop culture, had not completely become woke yet, as it is today. And so even a lot of the pop culture that we engaged in at the time fit into that rubric. It fit into that mindset. We remember all the great cop movies we had back in the 80s, and TV shows and so forth. We remember Dirty Harry, you know, where Clint Eastwood's got the .44 Magnum pointed at the criminal, and he says, Do you feel lucky, punk? Go ahead, make my day. You know, we used to repeat that on the playground when I was a kid growing up. I even remember an old video game. This would have been the late 1980s, so right around the time I was entering high school. There was a really popular arcade game that had come out around that time for the kids in our school. It was a video game called Narc. And it was a video game where you were a cop, or you could have two players. You'd both be cops, and you're going through these, you know, burned out inner cities, and you're shooting and arresting all these criminals. Usually you're shooting them. Occasionally you'd arrest one, but usually you'd shoot them. And you're shooting, you know, drug dealers and prostitutes and pimps, you know, and occasionally you're arresting one. But it was a very violent game. I mean, there's a lot of, you'd shoot them either with a gun, or sometimes you'd shoot them with a rocket launcher, and you'd see like dismembered arms and legs flying all over the screen, and it was great. And all the kids in my high school loved that game. We couldn't wait to go to the arcade, which the nearest big arcade to us was like 60 miles away in Springfield, Missouri. But whenever you go to Springfield, you'd always go by Aladdin's Castle so you could play Narc. That was like the funnest game. So that game and those movies like Dirty Harry, that could have only worked. That could have only been popular for us if it fit into the overall cultural mindset that we already had. That criminals don't deserve any respect or empathy. Now, I know to some of you younger folks, you're hearing me say that might sound strange to you. Why, you've been told you need to have empathy for everything. You've been told that nothing is anybody's fault, really. Well, except evil white people. But let me give you kind of a background for why we had these attitudes about crime. You see, when you grew up in the 1980s, particularly in a rural area, as I did, a very major part of our mindset and what we believed about human existence was wrapped up in the idea of personal responsibility. That ultimately, you were responsible for your actions, whatever they were. So, if like today when you hear someone say that, well, so-and-so found himself in a life of crime. No, you don't find yourself in a life of crime. You're in a life of crime because you chose that. You're in a life of crime because you made the decision to commit crimes. You see some movie somewhere or some book or some TV show that tries to make a criminal out to be someone that just let things get out of control, and before they knew it, they were involved in all of these criminal enterprises that they never would have done had they been thinking. And we knew instinctively back when I was growing up that idea, that mentality was garbage. That crime doesn't just happen to you. Bad behavior doesn't just happen to you. It doesn't just randomly appear like the way you catch the flu. No, it is a conscious decision, like everything else of value in your life is. In fact, I think all the way back, since we're talking about our youth here, I think all the way back to when I was maybe 3 or 4 years old in Sunday school. And there was a little song we used to sing in Sunday school every week. And I'm not going to sing it for you because nobody wants to hear me sing, not even me. But I will give you some of the lyrics to this little song that we learned in Sunday school. This song said, "Be careful, little eyes, what you see. Be careful, little ears, what you hear. Be careful, little feet, where you go." It was a Christian song, but the point of it and the life lesson from it actually transcends religion. The point of that little simple song for 4-year-olds in Sunday school was that it's not enough to just try to not misbehave or try to not sin. You as an individual are responsible for your own environment. You are responsible for what surrounds you. You are responsible for what you are exposed to and what you are not exposed to. Which means you, and only you, are responsible for making sure that you don't even allow yourself to be put into situations where bad behavior, where sin, where crime could even become a temptation, where it could even come about. It was the ultimate life lesson in personal responsibility. It was also the ultimate life lesson, if you think about it, in empowerment. That you are not a victim of your environment, you control your environment. You are not a victim of circumstance, you control your circumstance. Every last one of us does. Now that was the mindset, the very basic mindset that we lived our lives off of back then and in that area. So it makes sense that when the discussion turned to crime and criminals, that we wouldn't view them with any sort of empathy or sympathy. We would understand that what they do they make the conscious decision to do. And if they make the conscious decision to endanger us, to break the law, to endanger the police, to endanger law-abiding citizens, and they end up dying as a result, so what? They brought it upon themselves. But we seem to have had a cultural change in recent times now, haven't we? At least in some quarters. And I've got to tell you that with all of these protests we're seeing and all of this anti-cop rhetoric and all these Black Lives Matter things and all of these different people wanting to make massive police reform, with all of these proposed changes going on right now, that maybe the one cultural change out of all of this that is the hardest for me to understand and accept and tolerate is this cultural change where we're all supposed to feel sympathy or empathy for criminals. Because I've got to tell you, I don't have one iota of that in me. I don't have one iota of empathy for criminals, not in the least. So while everybody else is sitting there saying, well, this criminal got killed, let's deconstruct the situation and see what could have been done to keep this criminal alive, my first thought is, why? He was committing crimes. It doesn't matter if he's dead, because he brought it on himself. Why should the rest of us waste our time and our effort and risk our safety and commit our tax dollars to keeping these miscreants alive when they don't deserve to live in the first place? Why? And maybe in a more important sense, why are we lifting up criminals? Why are we deifying them? Why are we giving respect and demanding that others give respect to criminals that they don't deserve? Why are we doing that? When did that happen? Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I can answer those two questions. Why did that happen and when? But clearly it has, or at least it started to take a foothold to some degree. You know, I was thinking back to a viral video that Candace Owens put out right after the George Floyd situation. And it was like anything else in our modern society that has an impact. It was one of those things that got a great deal of praise from some quarters and a great deal of criticism from other quarters, meaning it must have been pretty darn effective. But Candace Owens, in her video about George Floyd and the Minneapolis situation, said something that I thought was so profound. She said that blacks have become, quote, the only community that caters to the bottom denominator of society, end quote. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized she's right. That certainly recently, but even going back a couple of decades, when we think of whatever you might call black culture, what do we think about? What's the first thing that comes into your mind? It's the drug dealers and the gangsters. It's the criminals. It's the street thugs. And that's not only what exists, but that's what has been glorified in the music, in the pop culture, in the movies, in the TV. And then whenever a situation like this comes up, where there's some sort of cop shooting or some sort of killing and everybody gets mad about it, you'll notice it's never the black entrepreneur in the three-piece suit who's shot dead by cops. It's always the black criminal. And yet we're told we got to deify these criminals. We're told these criminals have to be given respect, and that the loss of their life is somehow tragic. That's what we're told. That's what we're shoved down our throats. Meanwhile, the many blacks out there, and there's a lot of them, that work hard every day, follow the law, put together a life for themselves and their families, or even more so, some that have become massively successful in their own right by doing the right thing. Well, we don't really talk about them, do we? What has been promoted by the race hustlers in terms of the black community for 20 or 30 years has been the lowest common denominator of black America. And it's sad. They have elevated the worst among them. We told you a few weeks ago, and we mentioned a couple of times, that more whites are killed by police officers every year than blacks. But yet you almost never see marches or demonstrations on behalf of those white criminals by white folks, do you? And do you know why? Because we don't deify our criminals. We don't elevate our criminals. We realize if they got shot by a cop, they probably had it coming because of their own decisions in life. And so, yes, I think there's room for criticism, and I know some people will get mad about this, but there is room for criticism when we see the black community, or those who claim to represent it when really they don't, going around trying to promote these innocent black criminals who were killed. Well, that's not exactly how you're framing it now, is it? Candace Owens hitting the nail on the head with that. That we've seen within the social justice movement so much attention placed on the empathy for the black criminal, or take black out of it, just on criminals in general, that it doesn't make sense for a right-thinking, law-abiding, hard-working citizen, whoever you are. But as much as that's happened in the black community, as Candace Owens has pointed out, I have a sick feeling that it may be spreading. Because look at what Democrats have been doing for the better part of the last decade. Yes, they've taken their part in all of this deification of the black criminal. Yes, but that's not all they've done. We've seen Democrats and leftists as a whole cater to the bottom denominator of society, no matter what race or color is involved. Have we not seen the Democrat Party for 4 years or more deify illegal aliens and do everything they can to make sure illegal aliens are comfortable and that they get health care and that they're helped across the border and pat on the head? Why, yes, we have. Have we not seen whenever there's a Muslim terrorist attack anywhere in our country, have we not seen the Democrats come out saying, well, you've got to make sure all their rights are intact, and you can't go around making judgments on their religion, even though their religion brought down 2 buildings on 9/11. No, you can't do that. No, don't you dare shut down a mosque. Don't you dare do anything that could be untoward towards these Muslims that have committed terrorism time and again. No. It's becoming apparent on the American left and the Democratic Party in particular that anytime there is a miscreant, a scumbag, a criminal, a dangerous person to be found, it will be the Democratic Party who comes out to defend them at our expense. That's the reality. But I got to wonder if there's some sort of backlash that might eventually come about because of this. From normal Americans trying to live their lives and protect themselves and keep what they've earned and protect it from those criminals and thugs out there. In his book, The Invisible Bridge, Rick Perlstein once wrote, quote, liberals tend to get into the biggest political trouble when they presume that a reform is an inevitable concomitant of progress. This is when they are most unprepared for the blinding backlash that invariably ensues, end quote. I wonder if we might be on the cusp of that right now. You see, the American people are a tolerant bunch. Even if we don't completely buy what you're talking about, we'll at least hear you out until the point where it gets ridiculous. In the George Floyd situation, even a lot of us who've never really thought about police brutality before or ever considered it a problem, at least heard those people out in the George Floyd case, because the George Floyd case was one where the cop clearly went over the line. So we're willing to hear people out. But then we see all the violence and the looting. And then we see another case in Atlanta where someone was not innocent, where someone did try to take an officer's life and got what he deserved out of it. And we still see the same kind of arguments, and we start to scratch our heads a little bit. And then we see them going to the point of ridiculousness and forcing changes in brands of things and taking Gone with the Wind off the air and killing off Aunt Jemima, and we're like, wait a second. Y'all are just trying to take advantage of us, aren't you? This has gone far beyond what you said it was. And you look back at the COVID stuff when For 3 or 4 weeks, all of us, even if we were doubtful of it, we stayed home, we were dutiful, we did what we were told to do. And then we saw these leftist governors and mayors doing things like shutting down restaurants and telling you how many people you could have on a boat and not letting you take your kids to play in the park. And we're like, wait a second! You're just taking advantage of this! We've been pretty patient through this year. But I think within a couple of weeks, we're going to get to the point where people are going to start pushing back on some of this Black Lives Matter conversation. I know it's been the trendy thing now, and I know it looks like one-way traffic now, but people can only be pushed so far. And when it gets to the point where regular folks are thinking, wait, I can't even have my own opinion. I can't even question anything. I shall not say anything because something I said 30 years ago might throw me out of a job or something. People are going to push back. You watch. Give it another 2 or 3 weeks. It's going to happen. I'm going to tell you. Thank you for joining us once again. This is Travis Cook, America's Evil Genius. God bless you all. We'll see you next Sunday night.